So Christopher Hedges, great writer, as you all know, went around and wrote this fantastic piece. If you haven't read it, it's on a couple different platforms. I think it's on the Share Report, it's on Counterpunch, and so forth. But what he talks about here is Democrats are the more effective evil. And, this is just a fact, Jack. If you'll scroll down a little bit, I'm going to read this to you because, this is just mind-blowing, okay? This is absolutely mind-blowing. What he says is, when all else fails, when you're clueless about how to halt 7.5% interest rate, when your Build Back Better bill is gutted, when you renege on your promise to raise the minimum wage or forgive student debt, when you can't halt the Republican suppression of voting rights, when you have no idea how to handle the pandemic, which has claimed 900,000 lives, 16% of the world's total deaths, although we are less than 5% of the world's population. When the stock market fluctuates on wild roller coaster rides of highs and lows, when what little help the government offered to the labor force, half of whom, 80 million, experienced a period of unemployment last year, sees the termination of the extended unemployment benefits, rental assistance, forbearance for student loans, emergency checks, the moratorium on evictions, and expansion of the child tax credits. When you watch passively as the eco side gathers momentum, then you must make the public afraid of enemies, foreign and domestic. You must manufacture an existential threat. Terrorists at home, Russians and Chinese abroad, expand state power in the name of national security, beat the drums of war. War is the antidote to divert public attention. We've seen this before, right? From government corruption and incompetence. No one plays the game better than the Democratic Party. The Democrats, as journalist and co-founder of Black Agenda Report Glenn Ford said, are not the lesser of evil. They are the more effective evil. Rest in peace, Glenn Ford. I want to read this last part of the quote here because this is really, really important as well. And there's a lot more to this article, but I want you all to hear this because I think this will play into what we talk about with our next guest. The U.S., burdened by de facto tax boycotts by the rich and corporations, is sinking in debt. Sorry, Chris, you got it wrong. There you get it wrong. This is one of those things where Chris Hedges probably needs to stay out of the economic discussions. Okay. But the government budget deficit was $2.77 trillion for the 2021 budget year that ended September 30th, the second highest annual deficit on record. Do you see this? I want you all to understand why I'm reading this. As you heard the first part, you're like, yes, yes, yes. And then Christopher Hedges starts playing into the neoclassical standard bullshit jargon about deficits and debt. It's like, dude, have you not read Stephanie Kelton's Deficit Myth book? I love you to death. You're one of the best there is, but this is just unacceptable. It's like the total U.S. national debt is over 30 trillion. Household debt grew by 1 trillion last year. Now that matters. Household debt rising 1 trillion and that matters. U.S. government can always pay its debts, period, full stop. But you and I, think about what your bank account looks like. Think about what your credit looks like. Think about what happens when you take on too much credit card debt, when life happens and you can't pay your bills. See, this is playing on that. But this is not the same thing. National debt is the United States government, and it creates a currency. It can never go broke. So Chris Hedges, learn you some economics, brother. Anyway, let's get out of this one, Colin, if you don't mind. I want to make sure that everyone understands that there's a lot of misinformation right now about the economy and about inflation and the entire story that goes into having a legitimate conversation about how to fix these problems. You can't fix them if you don't understand them. And clearly, Chris Hedges, while he understands how bad the Democrats are, does not understand inflation, does not understand economics. And that brings me back to the Facebook thing. Colin, go ahead and throw those memes up there about there you go. So this meme right here is getting flagged all over Facebook. It's literally getting flagged all over Facebook because why? Well, on Facebook, They have fact checkers, and fact checkers say it can't be corporate greed that's causing inflation. It has to be printing money. It has to be all these stupid things that people that don't know anything about economics say. But here's Facebook playing Lord God Emperor, feeding into the same bullshit narrative. First, we heard Chris Hedges, who we all love, give you a bullshit narrative about inflation. Now we see Facebook cracking down using, and wait till you get this, they're using AEI, the conservative piece of garbage economics blast out there telling you that it couldn't possibly be corporate greed creating inflation. We have Chris Hedges, who we all know and love because he's got a lot of truth telling. He is just not a guy to ever listen to for anything that has anything to do with economics. The guy is just not there yet. We got to work on it, folks. Got to work on it. But then you see Facebook literally cracking down and calling this BS. But if you look at who the source is that they're using, it's AEI. Of all the places that they would use for fact checking economics, they're using that conservative think tank. Can you give us the story about what's going on with inflation?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up, because this is really an important turning point that will stay with us for decades. If we lose this debate, and if we lose this this debate over the narrative about what actually causes inflation and how we tackle inflation, they're going to use this for decades to come to blame the inflation of the pandemic on, the government spending too much money on helping the unemployed and poor children and all of that, and using it against us for decades to come to balance the budget, and the whole inflation phobia and the deficit phobia and so on. So that's why it's important to really have a counter narrative to call their bluff, not just Facebook, but everybody else who's been, panicking about the inflation situation and pointing in the wrong direction. So when you look at pre-pandemic, what the drivers of inflation were in the US, and just to be very, very straightforward, inflation is basically the average price level going up from month to month, from year to year. That's what we call inflation. And it affects obviously the cost of living for most of us. So pre-pandemic in the US, we had four basic drivers of inflation that most people recognize. And those were healthcare, education, energy and transportation, and real estate. And with the effects of the pandemic disruptions to global supply chains and so on, we've had additional inflation pressure points related to logistics and shipping and particular products related to microchips and things like that. So when you look at inflation pressure points and actual prices going up, there's usually two factors that affect it. One has to do with the lack of productive capacity. In other words, when we run out of raw materials and skilled people to produce stuff and there's more demand, inflation will happen and those prices will go up. The good news about this is that with strategic investments in key areas, we can produce more. Productive capacity is producible. We employ millions of people, we increase productive capacity, and we tame that source of inflation at the source, whether it's housing or real estate or education and so on. But when you add the second factor, then you'll understand the problem we're dealing with the hijacking of the narrative. The second effect that actually causes inflation pressure points has to do with what we call abusive market power. When you're influential enough in the market, when you're dominant enough, you can raise prices simply because you can. And you can raise prices even more during a pandemic and during an inflation phobia moment because everybody's already in tune with the idea of inflation. So you just tell them, well, we're covering our cost of doing business. So that's why we're raising prices, when we really understand, and most people have seen it right now, that they're actually not just covering the cost of doing business related to the pandemic. They're actually taking advantage above and beyond. And that kind of inflation that's driven by abusive market power, you can't get rid of it by spending less or by cutting the deficit or by reducing subsidies to the poor, to the unemployed, to hungry children. You only deal with it by taxing and regulating their abusive market power out of existence. In other words, you democratize the market, you make it more competitive, and you make it less monopolistic. And that's the problem, because who are the lawmakers who are supposed to do this, to tax and regulate this abusive market power? It's the 535 people we elect in Washington, D.C. Are they a government of the people, by the people, for the people? If that's the case, then we have a democracy.
United
But they're not.
Corporations of America.
Exactly. But they're a government of the super PACs, by the super PACs, for the super PACs. And that's why this inflation question is really a question of democracy. It's a question of survival. And if we lose the debate about how we actually tame inflation, they're going to use this narrative against us for years to come.
That's a great point. I want to bring up, obviously the Fed is talking about tightening monetary policy, talking about increasing interest rates, talking about going and using old tools they used in previous recessions and things like that.
Yep.
When we sit there and put inflation as the cure by using interest rates, we in fact create inflation. At least that's what Warren Mosler would say. I'm curious, why do they keep falling back to the concept of raising interest rates at the Fed to stave off inflation? What is the point of that?
Because their theory of inflation and their understanding of inflation, which is not pure economics, it's political too, and it's
Mysticism.
ideological. It has to do with the assumption that inflation is driven by too much demand because the government spent too much during the pandemic. We've been so generous with the poor, with the unemployed, with people who have been displaced by the pandemic, with children, so that we get at least half of them out of poverty during the pandemic. We've been so generous that we've fed people so much income that they've gone out on a shopping spree, and now they're spending too much and the economy can't handle it. So what we're going to do, we're going to take away the spending, which is where the fiscal spending cuts are going to happen. And at the same time, we're going to raise interest rates to increase the cost of borrowing, to slow down additional spending. And when you do this, you're essentially automatically throwing people under the bus, and it's actually worse. You're actually not taming the sources of inflation. Now tell me, Steve, how is raising the interest rate going to stop the COVID spread, stop the supply chain disruptions? How is it going to stop the abusive market power of pharmaceuticals, of real estate companies, of oil and gas companies? It does nothing to it. So we're not addressing the source of inflation. We're just sacrificing millions of people, throwing them under the bus in the name of fighting inflation. And this is not the first time they've used this. This is the narrative that was used in the 70s. And it's important for people to remember their history and understand it with the counter narrative. Because most people, including a lot of progressives today, they say, oh, we've seen this before, the inflation of the 70s. That's how we ended the inflation of the 70s. The Fed raised interest rates, and Reagan and Thatcher cut spending and privatized everything. And eventually we broke the back of inflation.
It wins.
Completely false. The source of inflation in the 70s was a political conflict in the Middle East. It had nothing to do with labor unions, nothing to do with the welfare state, nothing to do with the Federal Reserve Bank. But they hijacked the moment, the political moment, to their advantage, political advantage, and said, here's what we're going to do. We're going to go after spending, right? We're going to go after labor unions. We're going to cut government spending. We're going to balance the budget. We're going to be fiscally conservative. And we're going to have the Fed raise interest rates to break the back of inflation. Well, guess how we tamed inflation in the US? The first step was finding a substitute to imported energy, because energy was the source of inflation. It feeds into everything we consume: petrochemicals, your hair product, your textiles, your transportation, your heating and cooling. All of it is cost related to oil prices. So what we did, and Jimmy Carter was part of this, was to deregulate the natural gas industry and started the fracking frenzy that we deal with today, because natural gas was a substitute for at least heating and cooling and producing electricity. That was one step. Jimmy Carter put a solar panel on the White House and was trying to encourage renewables, which Reagan immediately took down, by the way. But the ultimate thing that broke the back of inflation was not the Fed, it wasn't Volcker, it was finding a peaceful resolution to the conflict in the Middle East and signing a peace accord. That brought down oil prices, which completely brought down the ripple effect of oil prices throughout the system. But they hijacked the narrative, and they told us the way we won the inflation fight of the 70s was with being fiscally conservative and by raising interest rates. And now they're going to repeat the same hijacking process to ignore completely the actual sources of inflation that we're dealing with. Definitely don't bring up the abusive market power of pharmaceuticals and real estate and banking and finance. You've heard all the gatekeepers in the last few days come online on national TV say, no, it's not corporations, it's not greed. This is, we live with corporations and competition, all of that. It's just too much spending, and we need to raise interest rates and cut spending. And if we lose this debate, if we don't call their bluff, they're going to win this narrative, and they're going to use it against us for decades to come, to continue to throw people under the bus and say, we can't afford all that spending on welfare, on the Green New Deal, on healthcare, on education. We can only afford the status quo.
Thanks for watching, and make sure to tune in to Status Coup's daily live stream Monday through Thursday at 5 o'clock Eastern Time and Fridays at 4 o'clock Eastern Time.